Hey guys, my name is Rishi Agrawal and I'm delighted to be featured on the StudyTuber channel. I make videos related to general student life on my channel, whether that's about productivity, mindset, study skills, or even comedy. But today, I'm going to be taking a detour from my usual content to bring you one of my greatest passions, and that is history. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and I've even got my own email newsletter if you're into that kind of thing. So let's get started. What I'd like to share with you in this video is one of the most fascinating histories, and that is the modern history of the nation of Vietnam. Now, unfortunately, if I were to start talking about all of the history of Vietnam, I would speak for hours and hours and hours. So instead, what I'm going to do is look at some key events from the perspective of the city of Saigon, which I happened to visit with my family last December. What I find absolutely fascinating is that Saigon in Vietnamese actually means firewood. I think that's beautiful because it exactly describes the fiery history of this one city in Vietnam. Now let's begin at the beginning, or in fact, even before what many people consider the beginning, and that is, let's consider the first Indochina War. So in this war, you gotta understand, the Vietnamese have been fighting what they perceive as the colonists for a long time. So first, during World War II, the Viet Minh fought off the Japanese. Then after the Japanese were defeated and they retreated, there was a power vacuum in the country. So the question arose, who would fill that power vacuum? Would it be the Viet Minh? Would it be some other regional force? Or potentially, it could be the French. And that is exactly what the French thought. So they decided to come back and re-establish control of Vietnam. And that triggered off a 9-year conflict called the First Indochina War. Then let's move on to the final decisive battle. And that was the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, in which French forces tried to cut off supplies to nationalist forces in Vietnam, but were completely humiliated. As an interesting side note, the French general in charge at that time, Charles Pierrot, he confidently said before the battle, "I've got more guns than I need." And then after the battle, he felt so humiliated that he committed suicide by exploding a grenade near his stomach. So how did the battle for Dien Bien Phu end? What were its consequences? Well, in one word, they were decisive. Because the Viet Minh forces led by Ho Chi Minh, remember that name, completely quashed any French ambitions of returning to Indochina or their former colonies. So now let's move on. Once the battle is fought, you got to decide what the terms of them are, right? So this led to the Geneva Accords, or a conference in Geneva, as the name suggests, between the Viet Minh, between Russia, China, USA, USSR, everyone came for a nice talk in Geneva. Now the agreement that was drafted up in 1954 was called the Geneva Accords. And if you looked at its terms, you would have thought, man, this really solves a lot of the problems. Because under that agreement, Vietnam would have been divided up into two parts, with North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Then all international influence in the region was to be removed. So Vietnam would not just become another hotspot for the Cold War. Finally, there would be elections to finally reunite Vietnam into one single country. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Yes, because it was too simple. You see, the USA and South Vietnam never signed the agreement. So now I know what you're thinking, because I was thinking the same. Why didn't the USA and South Vietnam sign the agreement? Well, we can only theorize, but here are a couple of reasons. Firstly, you had the domino theory, which said that if one state falls to communism, then like a bunch of dominoes, each one will tilt over the other state. So not only would Vietnam become communist, you'd have Korea already communist, then you'd have Cambodia communist, you had Laos communist, and maybe you'd even have India communist. Remember, we're talking about the Cold War here, and the Cold War just saw a big battle between the USA and the USSR played out in multiple proxy kind of battles, such as Vietnam. Another thing is, Eisenhower, who was the president at that time, writing in his memoirs in 1980. Another thing is, as we got to know later on in the 1980s when Eisenhower wrote his memoirs, that the US government was really afraid because Ho Chi Minh would have probably been supported by 80% of the peasants in Vietnam or the landowners in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh would have won, and Ho Chi Minh was a communist. So they could not afford to have those free and fair elections take place. Another reason why the USA and South Vietnam did not sign was because probably of Cold War mistrust. You see, North Vietnam, in terms of Ho Chi Minh, he also didn't want to sign the Geneva Accords. But he was pressurized into doing so by Russia and China. So he signed. And now, a fascinating side note in the annals of history. So at this Geneva Accords, you also had India, you also had the USA, the USSR, China. And at first glance, you may think, what do these people have to do with it? It's a conflict between Vietnamese and Vietnamese. Well, obviously, you can see the Cold War nature of this conflict in display at the Geneva Accords in terms of who was attending. And in addition, why was India there? Because India, under Jawaharlal Nehru, was pursuing this policy of non-alignment. It was the head of the non-aligned movement. And it's another example of how Nehru's policy back in India was being exported to the world at large. So that's the first of these interesting history side notes. So what happened next? Well, in South Vietnam, which by now you should know was allied with the US government. Well, in 1955, there were elections in South Vietnam, and Ngo Dinh Diem was elected the Prime Minister of South Vietnam. Now, Ngo Dinh Diem was a Catholic, and he came from the rich landowning class of Vietnam. In fact, majority of Vietnam's population, around 90% or even 95%, I'm not really sure, was Buddhist. And Ngo Dinh Diem's regime was highly unpopular because of the way he treated the Buddhist monks, as well as his disdain for all Buddhist culture and extreme corruption in his regime. Corruption, nepotism, you name it. Now the question arises, why did the USA support Ngo Dinh Diem when he lacked almost all popular support? And that's simple, because as John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State at that time, said later on, we didn't know of anyone better. In fact, here's where things start to really go downhill, and in fact turn outright violent. Because you see, in 1962, two fighter pilots from Ngo Dinh Diem's own Air Force rebelled and turned their planes around and bombed the palace in which he was living in, the palace known as the Independence Palace. Now another interesting history side note. Ngo Dinh Diem claimed divine protection. Why? Because one of the bombs landed in his study where he was reading, but it failed to explode. And while I'm at it, I might as well tell you to not forget the Independence Palace, because it features once again in a very dramatic moment in later Vietnamese history. Opposition to Ngo Dinh Diem's regime began to become increasingly fervent. It began to become more and more powerful. And finally, in 1963, the monk Quang Duc, he set himself on fire. So how did things culminate? How did all this come to a head? Well, there was a military coup against Ngo Dinh Diem. And in this military coup, Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother sought refuge in their church, which is the Church of Saint Francis Xavier in Saigon. I visited this church. It's a beautiful pale yellow building. And I've sat in the pew where he and his brother sat before they accepted the offer of the rebel generals for exile and safe passage out of Vietnam, never to interfere in Vietnamese politics again. Well, what happened then? Well, it wasn't such a happy ending for Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother. What happened was, they were being transported in an ARVN personal carrier, where they were suddenly and brutally murdered by the soldiers. When news of Ngo Dinh Diem's death broke out, there were actually celebrations in the seat in Saigon. And why? Because Ngo Dinh Diem, being the fervent conservative Catholic that he was, had banned all nightclubs, and all the nightclubs opened again the time his death was announced. So you can probably see now that the USA has always been involved in Vietnam, even before the Vietnam War formally began. Well, how did the Vietnam War officially begin in the first place? There was what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which allegedly North Vietnamese patrol boats fired on the USS Maddox in two separate incidents. You know what's really interesting? The second incident never even happened. Yes, that's right. The second incident never happened even in the first place. So the question is, why did Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, the President of the United States, why did he make up this incident? Well, it might have been to make sure that the USA got involved in a full-scale war in Vietnam due to the domino theory as we talked about earlier, and also because Lyndon B. Johnson might have thought that it was the only way to stop the spread of communism in Vietnam. Now once again, let's jump over huge swaths of history all the way to 1968 with the Tet Offensive, a massive offensive launched by the North Vietnamese against the South Vietnamese to incite the South Vietnamese to rebel against their own government. The Tet Offensive brings us back again to Saigon as the center of the action. In fact, in Saigon, a group of North Vietnamese specialists tried to capture the US embassy, and they succeeded. In fact, the fighting was so dense, it was so brutal that the US forces had to fight room from room, retake the US embassy. The Tet Offensive, named so because it occurred during the Vietnamese New Year, called Tet, was a turning point in the Vietnam War, because at that point the entirety of America began to slowly realize that maybe the war is not going as well as we thought. And finally, one day came the fall of Saigon, with the complete defeat of South Vietnam and the complete victory of North Vietnam. As North Vietnamese tanks rumbled into Saigon, CIA forces tried to evacuate as many people as they could from the rooftops of buildings. And in fact, I've been there, and we went to visit that iconic rooftop which still exists today. So that was the most amazing thing? Well, guess again. Because during the fall of Saigon, another amazing and really interesting thing happened. Remember that Independence Palace? During the fall of Saigon, a North Vietnamese tank rammed through the gates, and the soldiers in it grabbed the North Vietnamese flag and ran up the stairs of the Independence Palace, went right up to the roof and lowered the South Vietnamese flag and raised the North Vietnamese flag. Later, when the North Vietnamese generals arrived to take over power, the South Vietnamese general, General Min, said that they should have a ceremony to mark the official handover of power. Do you know what the North Vietnamese generals responded? You can't hand over power that you don't have. Well guys, I've always been somewhat of a history nerd, and I was even more so when I went to Saigon, which is a place which we'd studied in history during history class at school. And I really fell in love with the place. But today, Saigon is a wonderful place because of the pure culture of it. Due to the communist influence, you see all the signs in these streets, they all remind you of old-time communist posters because they were designed like that. Communist insignia is everywhere in Saigon. But the greatest thing you find in Saigon is not just some communist sign or something. It's hope. Because Saigon and Vietnam as a whole is really young. I really hope you visit Saigon or at least some other part of Vietnam and maybe pay witness to the horrors of the Vietnam War. Because as my tour guide in Vietnam said, at the end, there was no victor or there was no loser in the Vietnam War because all of us lost. So thank you for watching. My name is Rishi Agrawal. It was my pleasure to share my passion for history with you, and I'll catch you next time.